In the quiet town of Ridgewood, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of the United States, an old widower named Mr. Reuben lit candles in his late wife Clara's room every night. Rumors swirled that he was attempting to summon her spirit, desperate for one last conversation. One fateful evening, as the final candle flickered, a chilling presence filled the room. A voice, not Clara's, whispered his name. The air turned cold, and shadows danced menacingly on the walls. Something, or someone else had answered his call. In the quiet town of Ridgewood, life moved slowly, except for Mr. Reuben, a widower haunted by loss. Clara, his wife of 40 years, had been his joy and anchor, but her sudden death 3 years ago left him broken. Once a man of warmth and laughter, Reuben now lived in shadows, a ghost of his former self. Their modest cabin, nestled among oak and pine trees, remained a shrine to Clara. Her sewing machine stood untouched, her favorite quilts neatly folded, and her room preserved as if she might return at any moment. Every night, Reuben lit a single candle in that room, whispering her name into the stillness. "Clara, my love," he would murmur, his voice cracking with longing. The faint scent of lavender, her favorite flower, seemed to linger, though no fresh blooms had been placed there in years. The townsfolk noticed his strange rituals and whispered among themselves. "He's calling her spirit," they said, their voices laced with pity and fear. Some dismissed it as harmless grief, but others spoke of danger. "When you call the dead," warned an old herbalist who lived nearby, "you invite more than just your loved ones." Reuben paid no mind to their warnings. His heart ached too much to care. He had read about rituals that could summon the spirits of the departed, and though he had never been a superstitious man, his desperation outweighed his doubts. Each night he hoped for a sign, a whisper, a touch, a glimpse of Clara's gentle smile. One stormy evening, as the wind howled through the trees and rain pattered on the tin roof, Reuben decided to go further. He arranged 3 candles in a triangle on Clara's table, following the instructions of an old booklet he had found at a flea market. With trembling hands, he lit the candles and closed his eyes. "Clara, if you're here, please, let me feel you," he whispered. The room was silent. The candles burned steadily, their warm light casting flickering shadows on the walls. For a fleeting moment, Reuben felt a strange warmth, like Clara's hand on his shoulder. His breath caught, but when he turned, there was nothing. The sensation vanished as quickly as it came. Still, he clung to hope, convinced he was close to reaching her. But his actions were not without consequence. The air in the house grew heavy, almost oppressive, and the townsfolk began to report unsettling occurrences. Neighbors claimed to see shadows moving in Clara's room when Reuben wasn't there. Others swore they heard faint whispers on the wind, voices too soft to understand but chilling all the same. "Reuben doesn't realize what he's doing," the herbalist muttered one day, shaking her head. "Grief can be a beacon, and not all who answer it come with good intentions." Reuben remained oblivious to these warnings. To him, love was stronger than death, and his devotion to Clara was unwavering. "Even the grave can't keep us apart," he told himself each night, his voice trembling with both hope and sorrow. What he didn't know was that something had started to take notice. Not Clara, but something far darker. As the candles burned lower each night, the shadows seemed to grow bolder, and an unseen presence lingered just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the moment to make itself known. As December settled over Ridgewood, Mr. Reuben's home grew colder. It began with small, easy-to-ignore incidents. A chair slightly moved, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and candles flickering though no wind blew. At first, Reuben dismissed them. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, but deep down, unease stirred. The feeling that something was watching him lingered, though he convinced himself it was Clara. One night, as he lit the candles in Clara's room, their flames flickered violently, casting distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The shapes seemed almost human, yet twisted and wrong. Reuben's breath quickened. "Clara, my love, are you here?" he whispered. The room's stillness felt heavy, as though holding its breath, waiting for something. The next morning, Reuben found the melted wax had hardened into claw-like shapes. His hands trembled as he cleared them, but he clung to hope. "It's her," he told himself. Yet, as days passed, the disturbances became harder to dismiss. Clara's photo fell, its glass shattered. Her sewing machine, untouched for years, creaked faintly at night. Whispers grew louder, unintelligible yet chilling, echoing through the house like voices carried by the wind. Despite this, Reuben convinced himself it was Clara. "She's trying to reach me," he said aloud, though the air in the house felt colder, darker. The warmth he associated with her was gone, replaced by something sharp and oppressive, yet he refused to abandon his nightly ritual. Neighbors began noticing, too. Lights flickered in Clara's room, and some swore they saw shadows moving behind the windows. Others avoided his house altogether, claiming it gave off an unnatural energy. One morning, Mrs. Nita, a neighbor, approached him. "Mr. Reuben, stop what you're doing. Spirits don't belong here," she warned. "You're inviting something you don't understand." Reuben dismissed her. "It's Clara," he said firmly, though doubt gnawed at him. That night, as wind howled and rain drummed on the roof, Reuben lit the candles again. Their flames burned unnaturally high, casting long shadows. The air turned icy, his breath visible in the cold. Suddenly the candles snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. A low growl rumbled from the corner. "Clara!" he called, his voice shaking. The answer came, a guttural whisper, his name drawn out in the dark. "Reuben." The candles reignited on their own, their flames wild and high. Shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, grotesque and chaotic. Terror gripped Reuben as he realized, whatever had answered him, it was not Clara. When the candles burned out, he sat frozen, trembling. Something had crossed into his home, and it wasn't leaving. By morning, Reuben resolved to seek help, but where could he turn? The herbalist's warnings echoed in his mind, but his longing for Clara clashed with his growing fear. Alone in his grief, Reuben realized he might have opened a door he couldn't close. As the sun rose, its warmth failed to touch his heart, which remained cold with dread. The morning after the terrifying encounter, Mr. Reuben sat on the wooden steps of his cabin, his hands trembling around a cup of coffee. The voice from the night before echoed in his mind, deep, guttural, and undeniably real. Whatever he had summoned, it wasn't Clara. Desperate, he sought out Mrs. Pina, the town's herbalist who had once warned him of the dangers of calling the dead. Mrs. Pina's hut, nestled at the edge of the forest, was filled with the scent of herbs and smoke. She gave him a knowing look. "You've invited something dangerous into your home, haven't you?" she said sternly. Reuben's voice cracked as he admitted the truth. "I just wanted to see Clara again. Please, help me." The herbalist sighed deeply. "Calling a spirit isn't simple. Grief blinds you, and your pain is like a beacon for darker entities." She hesitated before continuing. "There is a ritual to summon the dead, but it's dangerous. You must be certain of your intent, or you'll open the door for something else." Desperation clouded his judgment. "I'll do it, whatever it takes," he insisted. She described the forbidden ritual, a circle of salt for protection, candles to guide the spirit, and a prayer to anchor it. But she warned, "You must not waver. If your focus falters, something far darker will answer." That night, Mr. Reuben returned home and prepared. He laid the circle of salt carefully in Clara's room, lit the candles, and burned dried herbs that filled the space with a bitter smoke. Kneeling at the center of the circle, he began the prayer. His voice wavered as he whispered, "Clara, if you can hear me, return to me, even for a moment." The room grew colder with each word, the candlelight casting jagged shadows across the walls. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of lavender. A shape began to form in the corner, faint and familiar. Reuben's breath caught. "Clara!" he called, his voice trembling with hope. The figure stepped closer, but as it moved into the candlelight, it twisted. What had seemed like Clara's gentle form became grotesque, a warped face with glowing eyes and a mocking smile. "Reuben!" it hissed, its voice distorted but eerily familiar. The entity lunged toward the salt circle, its claws scraping against the invisible barrier. Reuben's heart pounded as he scrambled backward, realizing too late that his grief had clouded his judgment. The ritual had worked, but not in the way he had hoped. The candles flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then came a low, chilling laugh, echoing from every corner of the room. Reuben fainted, his body overwhelmed by fear. When he awoke, the candles had burned out, and the salt circle lay scattered on the floor. The oppressive presence lingered, silent but heavy. Mr. Reuben realized he had opened a door he could not close. Whatever he had summoned, it was still there, and it was waiting. After the failed ritual, Mr. Reuben's home became a prison of fear. The air felt heavier, shadows lingered longer, and the presence of the entity became undeniable. At first, it was whispers in the night, faint and menacing. Then it grew bolder. One night, the sound of Clara's sewing machine broke the silence. Reuben's heart raced as he crept toward it. The wheel turned slowly, creaking in the stillness. He froze, his breath catching, and whispered, "Who are you?" The only answer was a low, chilling laugh. In the morning, scratches appeared on the floor near the sewing machine, deep, claw-like marks. Fear gripped him, but Reuben refused to leave his home. "This is Clara's house," he muttered. Yet the oppressive presence grew stronger, pressing against his chest with every passing hour. As days passed, the entity began mimicking Clara's voice. "Reuben, my love," it whispered at night, so convincingly that he almost responded. But the voice would distort, breaking into a cruel laugh. The entity was toying with him, feeding on his grief. The townsfolk noticed Reuben's decline. His gaunt face told a story he wouldn't share. Mrs. Pina, sensing his suffering, visited uninvited one afternoon. The moment she stepped into his house, she froze, clutching a charm around her neck. "There's something here," she said. "It's not Clara." Reuben nodded, tears welling. "I know," he admitted, "but I don't know how to make it leave." Mrs. Pina sprinkled salt and muttered prayers. When she reached Clara's room, she stopped. The melted candles from the ritual remained, their shapes grotesque. "This thing feeds on your pain," she said grimly. "You must face it, or it will consume you." That night, Reuben prepared himself for what felt like a final confrontation. He lit candles in the living room, holding Clara's rosary tightly and a bottle of holy water blessed by Mrs. Pina. Hours passed, each stretching into eternity until the shadows began to move. The entity appeared slowly, its form twisting in the flickering light. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. "Why are you afraid, Reuben?" it taunted, its voice a distorted echo of Clara's. "Isn't this what you wanted?" "You're not her," Reuben said, his voice trembling but firm. His heart pounded, but he tightened his grip on the rosary. The entity laughed, a sound that resonated deep in his chest. "You called me," it said, stepping closer. "Now you're mine." Summoning every ounce of courage, Reuben threw holy water toward it. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into shadows that twisted violently. The sound was so piercing that Reuben dropped the bottle. The entity vanished into the darkness, but its laughter lingered, faint and menacing. Reuben sat in the circle of candlelight, trembling. For the first time, he realized this was not a battle of strength or will alone. The entity was bound to him now, tied to the grief that had consumed him. It would not leave until it had claimed what it came for. In the days that followed, Mr. Reuben's life became unbearable. The entity no longer hid in the shadows. It haunted his every moment. Whispers filled the night, objects moved on their own, and the air grew suffocating. Sleep evaded him. Even when he closed his eyes, he felt the weight of its presence. One stormy night, the entity finally spoke its purpose. As Reuben sat trembling in Clara's room, clutching her rosary, the shadows shifted. The creature emerged, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. "Why do you resist?" it hissed. "You wanted her, didn't you?" "You're not Clara," Reuben whispered, his voice shaking. "You're something else." The entity laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the room. "Clara is gone," it said, "but I can bring her back, for a price." Reuben froze, his heart pounding. "Bring her back?" he asked, his voice trembling. "A life for a life," the entity replied. "You give me what I want, and she will be yours again." The offer tempted Reuben, the thought of seeing Clara too powerful to ignore. "Whose life?" he asked softly. The entity's grin widened. "Does it matter?" Tears filled Reuben's eyes as he clutched the rosary tighter. "I won't do it," he said, shaking his head. "I won't." The entity's grin faded, replaced by cold fury. "Then you will suffer," it hissed. "Your grief will consume you until there is nothing left." The candles snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. When light returned, the entity was gone, but its words lingered. The next days were worse. The entity taunted Reuben with visions of Clara, her face in mirrors, her laughter echoing through the halls. "My love," it would whisper, only to twist into cruel laughter when he reached out. The neighbors, sensing the darkness, avoided his house entirely. Whispers spread, "Mr. Reuben has brought something evil." Desperate, Reuben turned to Mrs. Pina. She listened quietly, her expression grave. "It's feeding on your pain," she said. "The more you hold on to Clara, the stronger it becomes." "How do I stop it?" Reuben asked, his voice cracking. "You must let her go," Mrs. Pina said gently. "Only then will it lose its hold on you." Reuben shook his head. "I can't. I don't know how." That night the entity returned, its form twisting in the candlelight. "One life," it whispered. "Give me one life, and she will be yours again." "No," Reuben said firmly, though his voice trembled. The entity leaned closer, its breath icy. "Then I will never leave," it said. "I will haunt you until your last breath, and beyond." As it dissolved into the shadows, Reuben was left alone with the crushing truth. This was no ordinary haunting. It was a battle for his soul, and the only way to win was to confront his grief. But how could he let go of the one person who had defined his very existence? The entity no longer hid in the shadows. It haunted every moment of Mr. Reuben's life. Day and night blurred as his home became a prison of horrors. Clara's sewing machine rattled at odd hours, whispers echoed through empty rooms, and shadows shifted unnaturally. One evening, Reuben saw Clara's reflection in a mirror. Her face was soft, her eyes kind, just as he remembered. "Clara," he whispered, stepping closer. But her face twisted, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, her eyes hollow. Cruel laughter filled the room. "Leave me alone," Reuben shouted, stumbling away. But the house only grew colder, the shadows thicker. Even during the day, the entity tormented him. Pots clanged loudly in the kitchen, doors slammed without warning, and the faint scent of lavender wafted through Clara's room. The presence was constant, inescapable. Neighbors whispered about him. Mrs. Nita left food at his doorstep but refused to knock. "He's cursed," she told others. "Something evil lives there." Reuben barely ate or slept. Each time he closed his eyes, Clara's voice or the entity imitating her would call out. "Reuben, my love," it murmured, soft at first, then guttural and menacing. Prayers became his only refuge, but even they felt powerless. One night he surrounded himself with candles in Clara's room, hoping their light would keep the shadows at bay. The air grew colder and the candles flickered. Shadows twisted and writhed like serpents creeping toward the salt circle he had hastily drawn. "You can't hide from me," the entity hissed. "You belong to me." Reuben clutched Clara's rosary, whispering prayers. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The shadows recoiled slightly but didn't disappear. The entity laughed, deep and mocking. "Prayers won't save you." Desperate, Reuben splashed holy water at the advancing shadows. A deafening screech filled the room, and the darkness retreated momentarily, flickering like dying embers. The room fell silent, but the entity's voice lingered. "You can't fight me forever." The next day, Reuben dragged himself to Mrs. Pina's hut. The herbalist looked at him gravely. "You're running out of time," she said. "The longer you let this go, the stronger it becomes." "I don't know what to do," Reuben admitted, his voice cracking. "It's too powerful." "It feeds on your guilt," she said. "You must face the truth about Clara. Only then can you banish it." "What truth?" Reuben asked, confusion clouding his face. "You know what it is," she said softly. "The longer you deny it, the more power it has. Face what you've buried, or it will destroy you." That night, Reuben returned home, her words echoing in his mind. He entered Clara's room, his eyes drawn to a folded letter beneath the sewing machine. With trembling hands, he picked it up. It was addressed to him, written in Clara's familiar handwriting. "Reuben," it began, "there's something I need to tell you." Before he could read further, the shadows surged forward and the entity roared with fury. The room erupted in chaos, and Reuben realized the letter might hold the key to his salvation, or his doom. The letter trembled in Mr. Reuben's hands as he read Clara's words. "Reuben," it began, "I've kept things from you. I never wanted to burden you, but I can't carry this guilt anymore. There are things I regret." Her confession was painful, a revelation of secrets she had hidden during their marriage. The words blurred as tears filled Reuben's eyes. The shadows in the room surged violently, and the entity roared. "She lied to you," it hissed. "She betrayed you. She's the reason you're suffering." Reuben clutched the letter tightly. "No," he whispered. "Clara wasn't perfect, but she loved me. That's what matters." The shadows recoiled slightly, but the entity sneered. "She deceived you," it hissed. "Let her go, Reuben. Let her go, and I'll free you." Reuben's heart ached, but he steadied himself. "I won't let you twist her memory," he said firmly. "We all make mistakes. I forgive her." The entity shrieked, its form flickering wildly. The candles blew out, and the air grew thick. Reuben felt the weight of the shadows pressing against him, the darkness suffocating. But he held on to the rosary in one hand and the letter in the other. "Let me go," Reuben cried. "I forgive her, and I release her from my grief." The entity's mocking laughter faltered, turning to a guttural growl. "You can't let go. She's all you have," it spat, its desperation growing. Reuben shook his head, his voice stronger now. "I loved her, but it's time for me to let her rest. You have no power here anymore." The room trembled as the entity unleashed a final, deafening roar. Shadows swirled around him, their tendrils reaching for the light of the letter. But as Reuben whispered a final prayer, "Clara, I'm sorry. I love you. Be at peace." The letter began to glow faintly, its light pushing back the darkness. The shadows thinned, the entity's form dissolving into nothingness. Its voice faded, a final, desperate whisper. "No." And then it was gone. For the first time in years, the house was quiet. Reuben sat on the floor, trembling, the letter resting in his lap. The weight that had suffocated him for so long was finally lifted. The next morning, Reuben stepped outside for the first time in weeks. The warmth of the sun felt foreign but welcome. At the market, Mrs. Pina approached him, her face filled with relief. "You did it," she said softly. "You let her go." Reuben nodded, a faint smile on his face. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but it was the only way." That evening, Reuben lit a single candle in Clara's room, not to summon her, but to honor her memory. He placed the letter beside it, whispering a quiet goodbye. The scent of lavender filled the air one last time, and Reuben knew she was finally at peace. As he turned to leave, a soft voice stopped him. "Thank you, my love," it whispered, filled with love. Reuben smiled through his tears. He knew it wasn't the entity, it was Clara, bidding him farewell. The days following the final confrontation brought a quiet Reuben hadn't known in years. The house, once filled with shadows and despair, now felt like a sanctuary. The whispers were gone, and sunlight poured through the windows, bringing warmth he had almost forgotten. Reuben turned his attention to the garden Clara had loved. He cleared the overgrown weeds, replanted her favorite flowers, and tended to the blooming lavender bushes. The work was therapeutic, and soon the garden became a symbol of renewal. Neighbors, once wary of him, began to greet him with warmth. Some even stopped by to help, and Reuben welcomed their company. One morning, Mrs. Pina arrived with a basket of fruits. "It's good to see you smile again," she said, watching him prune the bushes. "The darkness has left you, Mr. Reuben." Reuben nodded. "Clara is at peace, and so am I." Mrs. Pina placed a hand on his shoulder. "Grief doesn't leave us, but it changes. What matters is how we carry it." Her words stayed with Reuben. That evening, he sat by the garden, watching the moonlight on the lavender blossoms. He thought of Clara, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Her love had shaped his life, and though she was gone, her memory remained a quiet strength. As time passed, Reuben reconnected with his community. He visited neighbors, shared meals, and joined gatherings he had once avoided. The house, once feared, now seemed filled with warmth and life. The shadows of the past had faded into distant memories. One afternoon, while clearing the attic, Reuben found a box of keepsakes from his life with Clara, a handkerchief she had embroidered, their wedding candles, and letters they had exchanged as newlyweds. He laughed and cried as he read them, each item a reminder of the love they had shared. Reuben decided to preserve these memories in a small wooden chest. He buried it in the garden beneath the lavender bushes. "This is where she belongs," he said softly, "among the flowers she loved." On the anniversary of Clara's passing, Reuben invited the townsfolk to his home. Together they lit candles in the garden, their glow illuminating the blossoms. Reuben shared stories of Clara, her humor, her strength, her love. For the first time, he spoke not as a man consumed by grief, but as one who had found peace. As the candles burned low, a soft breeze carried the scent of lavender through the garden. Reuben looked to the sky, his heart full. He didn't hear her voice or feel her presence, but he didn't need to. Clara was there, in the garden, in the house, and in the strength she had left behind. Reuben's days became purposeful. He cared for his garden, his neighbors, and himself. The shadows of the past no longer haunted him. They had become part of his story, a testament to his endurance. One evening, as the sun set, Reuben sat by the garden with a cup of coffee in hand. The lavender bushes swayed in the breeze, their blossoms glowing in the fading light. He smiled, a deep sense of contentment washing over him. For the first time in years, Mr. Reuben looked to the future, not with longing for what he had lost, but with hope for what was yet to come.